Welcome to the Macmillan Report. I'm Marilyn Wilkes, your host, and our guest is Tanya Sanchez, an assistant professor of political science at Yale University. Her teaching and research focus on international cooperation and international law. In particular, she studies how international law and organizations shape international security and human rights policy. She is currently working on a book on the domestic political factors that affect treaty compliance. Today we talk with Professor Sanchez about her supply-side theory of treaty implementation and compliance. Welcome, Professor Sanchez.
Thank you for having me.
Let us talk about your theory. Give us an overview.
So the piece that I'm working on right now has to look at domestic factors that affect whether countries comply with human rights agreements. Particularly, because I'm a political scientist, the politics that surround treaty ratification and treaty implementation. And by that, I mean how countries actually take a treaty and make it part of their domestic law and institutions. There's a lot of research in political science in this area, but a little bit has looked at the role that NGOs or other groups in civil society have pushed states to adopt treaties and implement them. But not a lot of work has looked at what I call the supply side, which is the government, mainly how legislatures and executives go about actually passing the laws and putting them into the books so that states can be in compliance with international agreements.
Okay. What led you to this work, and how are you doing the research?
So it started as part of my doctoral work. So I was looking at trying to explain why some countries seem to undertake some international treaties and do fairly well in complying, but others don't. So it's sort of a puzzle that I sought out to explore, and one that a lot of other scholars have looked into. And I started to look more at the politics surrounding that. And the way I went about the research was by first starting to look at what states have actually done after they've ratified agreements. Which you think that would be a pretty obvious place to start, but there was not a lot of data. So I started by actually collecting a lot of data, going through each country's penal codes, and also the records of how legislatures debated different bills to implement treaties into their domestic legal system. So I started by collecting a lot of data and subsequently doing some statistical analysis using that data.
Okay. Let's talk specifics. What are some of the countries that you could cite, for instance, that may have enacted a treaty a little bit differently than perhaps another country? Are there any correlations there or differences that you could speak to?
Oh, there's once you start looking, there are wide differences, and this is what's interesting about the project. So when I started looking at their penal codes, all the countries start with the same treaty, and then one of the treaties I was looking at was the Convention Against Torture. And they all started, they all ratified the treaty, and so you would think that all of their laws would pretty much mirror what the treaty said, criminalize torture, put some sanctions. And I started by looking at Latin America because the region is very uniform in lots of variables that allow me to control for other circumstances. If you look at the definitions, they define torture very differently from country to country. For instance, countries like Paraguay will make a requisite that you prove intent when you're trying to convict somebody of the crime of torture, which is not part of the treaty. They just sort of threw that in there. The sanctions vary widely. So you have a country like Argentina that will punish torture from 8 to 20 years. But Paraguay will be like 2 months to 6 months. So 2 months, 6 months, 8 to 20 years, big discrepancies. So I thought, why are some countries being very strong implementers, really following the treaty, putting strong sanctions, and why do we have other countries that have definitions that don't conform to the treaty and sanctions that are very weak and might not get us to.
And how does your theory explain these differences, these variances?
Politics. I think the theory sort of has a lot to do with who is in power, not just at the time that the treaty was ratified, but who is in power when they actually have to put the laws in the books, the preferences of the party in power, but not just what their preferences are, but also who their political opposition is and whether they can actually get those laws through the legislative process. As you know, getting a bill, passed is very complicated.
Yes. And
so
it's
often
almost a miracle when it happens.
Yes, it is. So I not only looked at how the politics affected, amendments of bills, but the time that it took. Some countries take, after they ratify treaty, 2 years to get the law. Some countries like Uruguay, 20 years. Why did it take 20 years? Well, they couldn't agree, and then the bill was killed in committee, and then it just didn't get picked up again until they had a change of power. Another party came in, they retook the bill, finally passed it through. They had more support, they had a majority in the legislature, so they didn't have to deal with a lot of the hassles that it takes for a bill to get through. So I look at that process and explain how, when they disagree about what they want domestically to happen, it stalls the process, and so we have a lot of states that get stuck in that process. It's a long and complicated process.
Right. So how does your supply side theory differ from current thinking?
It doesn't necessarily differ. It sort of supplements a side that hadn't been studied. A lot of other theories, which I call the demand side, explain how different people within the polity demand that the states undertake these agreements and implement them. So that research has looked a lot at how NGOs, civil society, activist lawyers, etc., push the government to actually get those laws in the books. So they're looking sort of at one piece of the puzzle, and I'm looking at another piece of the puzzle. But they, complement each other, because a lot of the states don't really get these bills going until there is that, demand from the people.
Right.
But then I'd go in and say, but that's not enough. The demand is not enough. You still have to have enough support within the legislature to get those bills going and actually get it in the books. And then subsequent to the law being passed, to actually fulfill the law, train your police, allocate funds, develop the policies that really get compliance with the treaties, and that takes a lot of work.
Do you ever think, though, that there will be a time when treaties can be enacted on an equal level, where one country does it the same as another country? It seems like politics will always have some role to play in that process.
I don't think that they'll ever be identical, but I think that's a good thing, because not all countries are identical, so you need to allow for some countries to sort of tailor it for their own individual situation. Their own legal systems vary widely, so what makes, a law that makes a lot of sense in one country in another country wouldn't work particularly well. But what you don't want is huge discrepancies, so you need to narrow that gap of what's acceptable variation. And I think that part of how you achieve that is by writing better treaties.
Okay.
The treaties leave up a lot of room for interpretation. They'll say something like, don't torture bad, don't do it, but then they leave a lot of the rest up to the states to fill in the blanks. And so if we were able to write better treaties, and maybe also at the international level give implementation assistance to countries, so they have a better idea of what the international community expects when they undertake these treaties, then we would see less variation.
Okay. And in terms of any conclusions that you have in terms of policy and how best, to move forward with enacting treaties, what would you suggest?
I think from the international community is give a lot more assistance to states, both legal, technical assistance, so to legislatures, to give them sample legislation of what we expect you to look at. A lot of the times states have to draft their own from scratch, and this is why we see a lot of variation. But in other treaties we have seen that international bodies like the UN will present to them sample legislation that often states just identically take it and try to pass that through. Also make it requirement that states actually pass a law within a time period, and not allow states to go on 20 years or so without actually doing something. So following up with the states and giving them assistance, helping them, what is it that's stalling the process? Sometimes there's not much you can be done because if it's politics, you just have to wait till you know, there's a configuration that comes in, or try to convince them. And that's where the civil society part is important, to try to persuade the legislatures and the people that this is a desirable bill and that it should be passed. So there's a lot of things that can be done depending on whether you want to operate domestically or whether you want to operate at it from an international level. So we think that, or scholars think that there's a lot of capacity building that could help countries, giving them the right tools to achieve the treaty goals.
Right, okay, very good. Thank you so much for being here with us today and sharing some of your work.
Great, thank you for having me.
Be sure to join us again for another episode of the Macmillan Report, made possible through funding from the Whitney and Betty Macmillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale.